screen. Okay. So first of all, my name is Azam Bakir. I am from the Department of Mechanical and Aeronautic and Astronautic Engineering at the University of Southampton, Malaysia. Um, First of all, let me just introduce our university. We are actually located at the Iskandar Putri region in Johor, quite near to Johor Bahru. So if you guys have been to Legoland, so we are about 5 minutes away from Legoland, and we are about 10 minutes to the second link to Singapore. So we just recently moved to a new campus in Eco Botanic. So this is our campus, our new campus, University of Southampton, Malaysia. Basically, the program that we are offering at our campus are mainly engineering. So engineering has been in Malaysia for 10 years now. This is our 10th year. We have mechanical engineering, aeronautic, and electrical engineering. And we recently has introduced new program, for example, computer science, and some other business program as well. For today, my talk today will focus more on computational biomechanics of the heart. So I heard that you guys have learned on continuum mechanics. So for this topic here, we are using continuum mechanics on simulating the heart. So before we go further, I think we have to look over on the how the heart is functioning. But first, why do we model the heart? Can anyone maybe put their guess? Why do we want to model the heart? Maybe you can put in the chat.
Maybe to study about our heart.
To study our heart, yes. Any other?
To do simple experiment maybe without doing with a real heart.
Sorry, I can't hear you clearly.
Do some experiment without using an actual heart.
Yeah. So the purpose why we want to model a heart is we want to understand the heart disease. So sometimes we are not clear how does a disease develop or what's the mechanics behind a disease. So having a heart model allow us to study what happened during a heart disease. And of course, if we have a heart model, we can also make use of that heart model to test a new device. So one example of device that we can test is this device here is actually this small section over here. This is what we call as LVAD, or left ventricular assist device. So this device is basically just a centrifugal pump. So what happens is if you have a weakening heart, it can no longer pump as much blood as it used to be. So, well, we mechanical engineer, when we see a low pressure, what do? We put a pump. So same thing, we can do the same for our heart. But of course, for human being, we have to test the new device rigorously. You have to do animal study, you have to do clinical trial, but alternatively, in addition to that, you can also test it first in a heart model. So that way, you reduce the cost of experimentation and also reduce the risk because you are implanting this on a human being, so it has to be very, very safe. And of course, we want to do some experiment. Sometimes physical experiment of course, physical experiment is important, but in some cases, you can't actually experiment some of the cases. For example, if you want to look at the actual stresses within the heart wall, that will be very, very difficult to do through experimentation. You can essentially take out maybe like from a cadaver heart, you take a piece of the heart tissue and then put it on a tensile machine. That is possible, but then again, that means you have to cut something. You have to be invasive. But with the modeling, you can guess how does what is the stress level without actually taking out the heart. So a brief anatomy of our heart. So for some of you who may have taken pure science during your high school, you might have seen this before. So essentially, the heart is actually a muscular organ. So it's made up of muscle cell. And this muscle cell here is make up of all the wall. Technically, it has 4 chambers. So there's 2 chambers at the top, which what we call the atria. And the main function of this is basically is just to circulate the blood. So I'm going to show you a video that explains this much better than me. Let me know, can you hear the sound? Good.
I'm sorry, doctor, but I can't hear the sound of the video.
Can you hear the video?
At the moment, no.
Oh, before this, can you hear it?
Still the same, cannot.
Maybe I'll just explain through. So basically, this is our heart. So it's continuously pumped. So basically, what happened is you have a blood entering through the right atrium over here. So the right atrium is at the top right of the heart, and then it enters the right ventricle. So those are the deoxygenated blood. So that means the blood that's already being used up, and then that will pump to your lung. So from your lung, it will enter the left atrium, and then it will enter the left ventricle subsequently. So you can see here, this is the inner chamber, and between the atrium and the ventricle at the bottom. So at the ventricle, we can see there's a valve. So this valve, it ensures that the flow is unidirectional, and valve also helps to generate the pressure as well, because when this heart is contracting, the valve will close, and that helps to build the pressure within the heart chamber. Okay, let's go back to the slide. So let's look at what's made up of our heart. Because when we try to model the heart, we need to understand the basics, the basic unit that build up the heart. So basically, if you were to exercise the heart muscle, and if you were to apply some enzyme to take out all the cell connection, then you will get this cell over here. You will be able to view this under microscope. So this is a single myocardial cell, or what we call as the cardiomyocyte. So this is a single muscle cell. So you can see here this striation pattern. It's kind of like having a stripes. So that is the one unique characteristic of muscle cell. It has that stripe. And if we were to provide electrical signal, we can see that it's contracting as shown here. For heart muscle, some part of heart muscle, it has capability to contract on its own. That is one unique thing about the heart. And if I were to, let's say, put some electrical electrode, maybe here and here, then I will be able to measure the change in electric potential. So I can check what is the electric potentials within this cell. So what I mean by electric potential is you got some voltage as the cells contracting. And that voltage is what we call as the action potential. So here I have this plot over here. You can see here this dark line. That dark line is what we call as action potential, is the change in the electric potential of the cell. So once it's contracting, you need to have this action potential. So this action potential will trigger the cell to contract. So typically, if you watch any medical drama or anything that wants to show some people dying, you will see that ECG waveform, and then it goes to flatline that indicates that person already passed away. So that electrical signal that giving the ECG, that is made up by millions of cells working together, producing this action potential. And this cell over here, they are aligned at a specific orientation. So this specific orientation, like what we have in this figure at the right corner, it forms like a certain angular orientation. And in addition to that, it also being placed in a multiple sheet. And this multiple sheet provide us with a unique characteristic of the heart muscle. So can anyone guess what would be the material behavior for this heart muscle? Is it isotopic or anisotropic? What do you guys think? Can anybody guess? Is it isotopic or anisotropic?
I guess it's isotropic.
It's supposed to be anisotropic. So the reason why it's anisotropic, because you have a specific orientation of muscle. So this orientation of muscle, it will provide a certain stiffness along the muscle direction, as well as along the shape and normal to that. So this is what we call as an orthotropic property. So we can see, because this is just a drawing, we can see that that is actually the same on a real heart. So how does the heart function? So the heart function it starts contracting from the electrical activation spreading through the heart. So just now I told you, technically we can measure ECG signal. So that ECG signal arises because of the electrical activity within the heart. So typically it starts at one point at the right atrium, and then that electrical activation, it will spread through the heart. So it will spread through quickly, and as it's spreading, the muscle will contract. What we will be seeing when the muscle contracts is we'll see some thickening of the wall. And you can actually see in this image here that there's some thickening. So this is our heart here. We can see there's some thickening of the wall. And at the same time, the wall also twisted. So the reason why it's twisted because the muscle orientation is placed helical within the heart. So it's kind of like you squeezing, if you squeeze through towels. So that is the same mechanism that the heart is doing. And at the same time, we can see the long axis of the ventricle. So the long axis is this over here. You can see that it's shortening as as the muscle contract. So all of these motion over here, they are important because they are helping the heart to expel the blood. So this gives us the pumping motion that expel the blood out of the heart. So let me just explain a bit of cardiac cycle. So typically we can assess the heart behavior through what we call as a cardiac cycle. So if you were to place a pressure probe within the heart, then we will be able to see the pressure. Once we have the electrical signal, we will see that the pressure will develop. And because of the valve will only open once it exceeds a certain pressure. We can see once the valve open, the aortic pressure or the pressure within the blood vessel distal to the heart, it will be open. And in this phase is what we call as ejection phase because the valve open. So once the pressure drop, then the valve close again, then the heart will be filled up again. So this pressure and volumetric changes of the heart, we can put it into this pressure volume loop. So what we call as a loop. So technically there's four phase of cardiac cycle. So typically we start from this, let's say we can start from this point A. So point A, the mitral valve opens. So the mitral valve is the inlet for the left ventricle. So once the mitral valve open, the blood fill in the chamber, and then it keeps filling up and filling up and filling up. So this is what we call as filling phase. And then once it exceeds a certain pressure, the valve close, then the muscle start contracting. When the muscle contracting, the entire valve, all the valves are closed, so no blood can come in, no blood can goes out. So the volume stays the same. So that's why we see a sharp rise in pressure, but no change in the volume. So this is what we call as isovolumic contraction. And then from point D, once it exceeds a certain pressure, then the valve, the aortic valve open, and the blood is being ejected by the heart. And after a while, again, all the valve closes. You have isovolumetric relaxation because now all the contraction, the muscle starts relaxing. Then we can see that the pressure drops quickly until the next cycle started. So these four phases are what we call as the cardiac cycle. Okay, so those are the overview of how the heart function. And now we're going to go through the boring part or the mathematical part of it. But I try to tone it down as much as I can. So how do we model the heart? So just now we have looked at all the main thing that we need to know about the heart. So now how do we model the heart? So obviously you need to start thinking first what type of geometry that you want to use. So you can either use an actual geometry or you can just construct a simple idealized geometry, maybe using SolidWorks. And this geometry, you will need to mesh it as well, because you will need to solve it using finite element solver. So you will need to mesh it. And then you start to think about the material property. So just now I told you it is an isotropic material. So then you start thinking of what type of material that I should be using. Is it a hyperelastic? Is it a linearly elastic material or not? Then you have to start going through literature to see what would be the best option. And another thing that you have to think is the boundary condition. So what type of boundary condition that I should be applying? Because just now I showed to you the cardiac cycle. We can see the pressure changes within the heart. So obviously you will need some pressure boundary condition. So how do I determine that pressure boundary condition? And how do I fix how do I prevent rigid body rotation and translation? So one thing about solid mechanics simulation is in order to ensure your model to be successfully running, you have to prevent the rigid body rotation and translation. Otherwise, you won't be able to solve the model. And lastly, you also need to think of what's the input that you want to give to the model. So how do you want to initiate the contraction? So those are all the consideration that you have to think first when you start modeling this. So the first consideration that I mentioned is geometry. So you have two options. Technically, there's two options, either to use an idealized geometry. So in my PhD, what I did was simply using an idealized geometry as shown here. That's because you can see the bottom two chamber of the heart, they are basically just ellipsoid. So rather than having a much more complicated geometry, I just decided to use this ellipsoid. And one advantage of using this ellipsoidal geometry is they are easier to mesh. So meshing them is not a disaster, because if you have a realistic geometry, some area might be meshed badly compared to the other, and that can all affect your simulation as well. Or you can also use a realistic geometry. So realistic geometry, you can get it from MRI images. Okay. You can get it from MRI images, or you can get it from a CT scan and then extract that the geometry as what's shown here. So this image at the bottom is coming from a project called the Living Heart Project. This project is sponsored by the same company that made SolidWorks, Dassault. So they use their software to develop a living heart simulation. So that is their simulation over there. You can see, so all those color changes are electrical signals that they are simulating within the heart. And the second thing that you have to think about is the material characteristic within the heart. So I mentioned earlier that the heart is an anisotropic material. And that is mostly due to the orientation of the cell. So we need a way to define the orientation of the cell. So here, this image here that's coming from a cadaver and that's already been dried up, we can see actually that there's some orientation due to the muscle. And this orientation over here is important because it determines how does the heart behave. So we have to define our fiber or our cardiac muscle fibers. So here I showed it in a streamline. So this is trying to mimic what we have seen in the cadaver. And then we need to define our material property. So how do we define this material property? So we have to go through the literature to see what people have done through experiment. So one experiment that people have done in the past is a shear test. So what they did is they simply cut down some portion of the heart into a cube, like what we have here, and they loaded this cube in different orientation and applied a shear load. So they put it on the UTM machine, your universal testing machine, and look at the shear characteristic. And as we can see here, this is the result. So you can see there's some hysteresis. And afterwards, this data is fitted into some material model. So in this case, what I've been using in the past, this is what we call as a hyperelastic material, and they are orthotropic, meaning you have three different property in three different orthogonal direction. And in this model, it is also covering the isotropic characteristic of the heart. So the heart is also built up by a fibrous cell those are isotropic, but the muscle cell also provide some anisotropic, which is given by the second term over here. And the last terms also provide some anisotropic characteristic as well. So with this hyperelastic strain energy, we can characterize how does the heart autotropic behavior using this simple model. And one unique property of the heart that we need to consider is the active property, because the heart muscle, it can contract and relax consecutively. So if you were to take a strand of the muscle and you measure the stress generated by the muscle, you will see something like this. So it activates quickly and relax quickly as well. So what we can do to simulate this is to apply this active stress directly onto your second Payala-Kirchhoff stress. So there's two approaches. Either you add up this stress, this waveform here directly to your second Payala-Kirchhoff, or you calculated the strain and apply that to your deformation gradient tensor. So I won't go through the detail here, but I just highlight. I think you have seen these two terms, second Payala-Kirchhoff and deformation gradient tensor. So basically, we manipulate these to make the heart contracts. And we can define some boundary condition. So you can either fix the basal portion of the heart. So the basal is at the top here. You can either fix everything so it doesn't move, or you can allow it to move internally, or you can put some spring as well. So one study have done quite good comparative analysis is they found that if your focus is more on the stresses at the distal part or somewhere within the middle part of the heart, it doesn't matter which boundary condition that you use. So that is due to something called the Saint-Venant's principle. So the Saint-Venant principle, it says that the distribution of the load or the boundary condition at region further away from your test site won't affect much the result at the test site. So as long as you're calculating something further away from the boundary, so this boundary is unlikely to affect as much. And typically, because the heart is also interacting with your circulation system, remember the heart is pumping the blood through all the blood vessel. So you have to represent the blood vessel as a circuit. So one way is to represent it as a circuit. So rather than modeling it like a fluid mechanics, we can represent it as a circuit like this, because our blood vessel, it has some capacitance. It can take some blood, and also it can also restrict the blood motion. So we can represent that behavior using resistance and capacitance. So just like a circuit. And with this circuit, we are able to determine what's the pressure that's being applied on the heart. And this pressure, afterwards, we can apply that as a pressure boundary condition on the ventricular wall of the heart. So there's two approaches on how to initiate contraction. So you can either have like a action potential model, which what I did in the past. So in my action potential model, I actually have this skeleton here that simulate how does the electrical activation spread. So once it's received the electrical signal, then only it will contract. So with this, we can control how the contraction spreading. But in the early work, quite a lot of people actually just assume that all of the heart muscle or the entire heart activate at the same time. This is due to the fact that the time it takes for the entire heart to contract is roughly around 100 milliseconds. So it is a very small duration where you can just ignore the effect of spreading. So you can just assume it as a uniform contractility. But not all cases we can use this assumption. because in some cases where you start having a heart disease, the spreading might be slower. So once you have a slower spreading, then the mechanics of the heart has changed. So modeling this spreading of electrical activation can be quite important in some cases. Okay. So I think I'm just going to skip this, and I'm just going to show you a bit of what's the result that I've generated in the past. A moment. So this is one of my PhD model that I've done. So in this model, we can see this is actually a multi-physics model where I have the electrical model and the Navier-Stokes representing the fluid behavior. So it's a fluid structure interaction model. So we can see here, this model, it can simulate the heart contracting behavior. At the same time, it's also show how does it interacts with the blood. So with this model, we can actually use it to study quite a lot of things. For example, we can study the ischemic behavior, which I'll show after this. And if we were to measure the pressure, we're getting the pressure similar to what we have seen in a healthy human heart. So we can see here, if I were to plot the pressure versus volume plot, I'm getting the box plot similar to what I've shown before. So this box here, it represents our cardiac cycle, and in this case, I was able to replicate this in my model as well. And some example that we can apply this model is, for example, in cardiac resynchronization therapy. So this happens when you have some part of the heart is not activated. So what do? We simply apply electrical stimulus directly to the part that's not receiving the electrical signal. We can also simulate cardiac ischemia, where some part of the heart has died because it's not receiving enough oxygen. Or we can use that to simulate the heart pump behavior. So what I did in the past was I simulate this resynchronization model, and I was able to show that I was able to simulate how does the pressure drops when you have this condition, when you have a condition where the heart's not contracting as fast as it should. So we can see the drop in the pressure. And once we apply our electrical stimulus directly at the disease region, we can see some improvement in the pressure behavior. And the other thing that we are able to show is if we were to calculate the regional work, when you have a late activation in the heart, we can see that the healthy portion of the heart has to compensate for the disease section. But with if you apply a pacer or an electrode in the heart, that can somewhat restore our heart behavior. So this characteristic here, like regional work, that require us to use solid mechanics, continuum mechanics simulation to get all the stresses and the strain, which we can then make use of that to get the relative regional work. We can also simulate cardiac ischemia. So in this case, what I did was I simply assumed this blue region as a dead cell, and then it's gradually transition in the red region. So one thing that we found is when we look at the stress along the fiber, the stress at the disease region is positive while the other region is negative. So when you're contracting, you're supposed to get a negative stress, negative, in this case, strain, negative strain. But in this region, what happened was this dead spot is being pulled because the blood, instead of being pushed out, it's some of the blood now is pushing at the wall as well. So what happened now, your heart becomes inefficient. And one thing that we found is there's also some tethering effect. So we can see here that's at the border of the disease area, we can see that the heart's being pulled. So this phenomena is actually explained what clinician has seen. So we can see this pooling effect. Once it happens, it this that region to expand and expand and expand. So it actually aggravates the situation of your heart disease. So this model actually explains what happened with this heart. Also simulate this heart pump behavior. So one thing that we did was simply add the heart pump into our circulation model. And in this case, we are able to show that if you increase the pump speed quite severe, you will see that the heart chamber will, the mechanic of the heart chamber will change to the point that it simply collapse. So in this case, we can play around with the model to see what setting that the heart can collapse, so we can prevent it from doing that before we implant it on the patient. So to conclude, there's quite a lot that you can actually model with this heart. In the future, you might be seeing much more automated modeling approach, where, for example, you go to a clinic, you take a CT image of your heart or any of your organ body, and then we can send it to computer to run a simulation for you. So with this, we can plan the treatment properly, and uh, in the future, it will be becoming more common for medical device development to use such heart model in the future. In fact, the US FDA is also going to that approach and requiring some of the modeling work to be done now. So that's all from me. I think I can take question first, and then I think we can have the quiz. Dr. Jamil, what do you think?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Azam. So, any question from you guys, from anyone? If you would like to ask anything that um, you might think interesting, Dr. Azam is free to answer.
Hello, Doctor. I have one question. I'm just curious. Before this, you said as the head contracts, the wall is twisting, right? So if we are doing some heavy exercise, for example, running, so how does uh, the wall can withstand the twisting motion? Because the heart pump the blood very fast.
That's a good question. So during exercise, there's actually the heart will cope slightly differently when you are in when you are doing a strenuous activity like running or doing some workout. So okay, one thing that you will notice first is your heart rate will go faster. So typically, uh, the heart will need to increase the cardiac output, or how much the pumping rate that it has to generate it. So one way that they did is by increasing this heart rate. So that means you are pumping more, you're pumping more times, so that will increase the amount of blood going out. Um, so that is one way of the mechanism that the heart is coping. But in some cases, in some disease where, for example, if you have the ischemic, well, the heart will also increase its beating rate. But in some cases, that will cause what we call as arrhythmia, and in some cases, even worse, it's called fibrillation. So that is why in some cases you can see that people who are unable to exercise, they can collapse because the heart simply can't cope anymore. And there's also another mechanism called it's called Frank-Starling mechanism, where the heart actually contracts much stronger when you are working out. So you are actually pumping out more blood by the heart increasing its contractile stress. and by its increasing its beating rate as well. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Razak.
Okay, any more question? Okay, so I think that's it for today's session. So regarding the quiz question, I have posted to you guys in WhatsApp group, so you can answer it maybe before the end of today lah. Okay. So thank you again, Dr. Azam, for giving an interesting lecture regarding how we can simulate the heart using continuum mechanics and also finite element method. So I hope you guys learn something that maybe outside of what you have learned throughout your 4 years studies in mechanical engineering. So I hope it's something new that you haven't seen before. And that's it for today's session. And inshallah, we will meet again if permitted. Okay. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to Dr. Azam again.
Thank you, Jamil, for inviting, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Razak, for having us.